Hi, I'm Morgan Lockhart, and I'm the author of the magical romance novel, A Spell from Midwinter's Heart. But I also spent about 20 years writing video games, working on such titles as Halo 4, Halo 5, Tell Me Why, Rift, Guild Wars 2, and I'm here to talk to you today about writing video games. One of the things about writing for video games is you cannot get attached to anything. And because of that, over the years, I have really come to understand, sometimes because I literally was able to write the same things down multiple paths in choice-driven games, but in other cases just because I was constantly pushed to adapt a given story beat to changes that were happening around me or just the evolution of the game. So because of that, something that I've become really good at is imagining how the same beat could play out many different ways. And that serves me in anything I write now, because your first idea is often just drawn from whatever you're most familiar with, you know, the most familiar beat, what you just kind of expect to happen next. But if you really want to surprise people and give them something a little new, then it's often requires you to push beyond that first idea and really get creative and think about, okay, well, we have this same beat. It can be achieved all these different ways. Which way is most resonant for this character? Which way is most resonant for the genre/subgenre that I'm writing right now? How do I really unify everything that I'm writing and create these really well-shaped beats that hit on all these different levels? Games have really trained me to understand how I can view the same beat in all these different iterations. You're being required to reshape beats, sometimes on the fly, sometimes in the recording room, sometimes startlingly close to when the game is about to launch. I think in particular for the romance genre, one of the most important lessons I learned in game writing was respecting player fantasy and respecting audience expectations. In particular because I've worked on some very major franchises that have really strongly established player bases. You know, the worst thing you can do is roll in and have some idea that you're gonna mix things up or challenge maybe expectations, because even though it is good to evolve, people come to romance with certain expectations that need to be met, and many people will turn to a romance novel when they really need to be swept up and they really need that escape. And that is also something that's very true of fantasy and video games. So really being aware of your audience, that was one of the things I really learned over the years in video games. For me, I would say that the absolute biggest shift was pacing. Over the years, I have had to get comfortable with the idea that I cannot control how people experience this story. And that's the biggest thing that people who are new to video game writing, especially if they are used to mediums like books or movies, where you get to control exactly how a person experiences this story, it can be a really big shift to come to understand that you have to let go of that control. You had to be able to view your story in this very dispersed way, that people were not going to go through it at an exact pace, and you weren't going to be able to control tension in the same way, that tension was going to be built by the unique way that they experience the game, how they choose to play, how good they are at the game. You have to find a way to make the experience of the story meaningful, regardless of whether or not you can control how people experience it. And that was a big challenge. That's definitely the sort of thing that it took years to get good at understanding that. So one of the major differences between video game storytelling and novel storytelling is that piece of agency. In a video game, agency is an art unto its own. It really brings a person into a story in a different way. This is particularly true in games where you get to create your own avatar, but it's true even of games where you control a very strongly defined character like Master Chief or Kratos. So when you're approaching video game storytelling, you always have to take account for this white space of player's agency, of player interpretation. And even though people have headcanon for everything, people particularly have headcanon for video games. There's just gonna be this internal writing that happens. You really have to let go of control over what you're doing, and that you have to offer the story and see what people do with it and how they take it and how they make it their own. One of the challenges with writing romance in video games is you can't necessarily control both sides of the narrative that you can in a book. There's this phrase called kindness coins, this idea that all you're essentially doing is sort of moving your relationship up a track. You know, you're flirting your way up a ladder or doing favors your way up this romance ladder. And in particular in games where you sort of go to the same spot, whether you're romancing them or not, and then you add a romance layer, it's not as true to the experience as you might want it to be, right? Because Because romance isn't just about bonding, it's also about chemistry. And I think the romances that people get particularly excited about in video games are the ones where the chemistry came through really naturally. And sometimes that's to do with performance, sometimes it's to do with writing. Most of the time it's probably about both. And I do think that the stories where you're really able to see the romance exist outside of just these little romantic options, in particular in games like the BioWare games, Baldur's Gate, where the stories go beyond just these little vignettes of romantic dialogue and affect the scenes and affect how that broader story plays out. That's where you really start to see video game romances reach those same heights as book romances, where you really see people growing with each other and the romantic relationship really being a part of this person's art. And, I think one of the things that also really helps make the magic for me in video game romances is the possibility of failure. No matter how many favors you do, how many gifts you give, how many of those romantic dialogue options you do, if you make choices in that game that are deeply against that person's values, they will turn away. You will fail that romantic option. And I think you kind of need that in order to create those stakes, because what makes it so exciting is the fact that it might not happen. And even though it probably will, because this is a romance, you have to create the illusion that this could fail, What is potentially keeping these people apart? Create believable obstacles for these two characters to overcome, to be together. It's not just down to coincidence or external conflict or just misunderstanding. It really has to reflect this and be reflected into the internal journey of the characters so that they can grow together toward that happily ever after. One of the things I always think about is starting with theme, thinking about how you can create a story world that expresses that theme and how that theme becomes the unifying tissue for the world that you're building. It's not just throwing a bunch of things into a pod. It's basically being very deliberate about how you reshape the world, driven from theme. When I started building the world for A Spell for Midwinter's Heart, I really thought about the themes I wanted to convey. I started writing this at a time when I was feeling pretty disconnected, and I felt like a lot of people around me were feeling really disconnected. So I really wanted to start with connection and this idea that we're stronger together. The magic that I built in this story is very deliberately built around the idea that solo practitioners of magic can only ever go so far, that really the most powerful magic can only be accomplished as a coven. And one of the things that Rowan finds is the danger of trying to attempt that really strong magic by yourself, and that would also be present in the story. It's very much there in the story of how Rowan has to reconnect with her family, with her coven, with Gavin, in order to save her town. That's really one of the keys to making something that feels cohesive. What's that new brush you're going to repaint the world with? And how is that going to guide every choice that you make? That's especially important in video games because the world building extends not only to the story, but also to things like the aesthetic choices that you make, the environments that you build, even the gameplay, the UI. Theme is the thing that ties it all together and makes it feel like this is all one world. I think one of the most important things that really helped me level up my writing, game or novel-wise, was understanding why we tell stories, how those interact with our brains. There are some really great references out there. A book called Wired for Story. Brené Brown gets into it in some of her stuff. The human relationship with story is intimate. We are literally creating patterns for our brains. I think really being able to break story down to its pieces, you're gonna reflect it not only in the words that you write, but also in the mechanics, in the way that a player engages with your game. You're gonna build it into the environments. You're gonna build these little visual vignettes with your artists that show what happened here. Everything has story, everything is story, so getting really creative about that. And then on a very practical level, demonstrating that in your samples. Never apply to a video game job with prose. A screenplay is okay, but what you really wanna do is go out there and look at examples of all the different kinds of writing you're gonna have to do as a video game writer, put together a portfolio that reflects that, and then learn how to collaborate. Make friends with people in the industry, not as a sort of callous networking thing, but because those good relationships are gonna go a really long way, because they're gonna make people want to work with you. So yeah, practice, 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 and make friends. Thanks for having fun with me today. And if you're in the mood for some cozy romantasy this fall or winter, my debut novel, A Spell for Midwinter's Heart, follows a magic-averse young witch as she returns to her hometown for the holidays. There, she has to reconnect with her coven, as well as her disarmingly handsome former high school rival, in order to save the town's holiday festival from corporate takeover.